The Hegemony's Combat Assessment Center occupied the entirety of Level 47 aboard Station Nexus 7, which was impressive, considering the station itself was roughly the size of a small moon and had more levels than most species had brain cells. Not that anyone was counting, except for the bureaucrats who specialized in making simple things unnecessarily complicated, a talent that apparently transcended species barriers. Commander Zethkar of the Velthari stood before the observation deck's floor-to-ceiling transparasteel windows, watching the endless stream of starships dock and undock with the mechanical precision of a well-oiled bureaucracy. His forearms were crossed in what his species considered a contemplative pose, though to most other races it looked like he was trying to hug himself while simultaneously preparing for a fight. The Combat Assessment Center was his domain, and he ruled it with the iron fist of someone who had never met a challenge he couldn't reduce to mathematical equations and predictable outcomes. For the past 3 decades, he had evaluated over 10,000 species seeking membership in the galactic hegemony, and the results were as consistent as they were boring. The strong survived the initial phases, the weak were politely shown the door, and the genuinely dangerous were flagged for special consideration, a euphemism that everyone understood, but nobody talked about at dinner parties. Today's schedule was particularly mundane. The Corvani had sent another delegation of their warrior priests, who would undoubtedly excel at the combat trials, while completely failing to understand why shooting first and asking questions later wasn't always the optimal diplomatic solution. The ethereals from Proxima Vale would float through the intellectual challenges with their usual smug superiority, right up until the moment they encountered something that couldn't be solved by thinking really hard at it. And then there were the humans. The humans. Zethkar's mandibles clicked in what passed for amusement among his kind. Terra had been trying to gain hegemony membership for the better part of 2 centuries now, sending delegation after delegation of their best and brightest, each one failing more spectacularly than the last. It wasn't that humans were particularly weak or stupid, though the jury was still out on that second point. It was that they were so wonderfully, consistently average at everything that mattered. Their technology was functional but uninspired. Their military tactics were straightforward to the point of predictability, and their diplomatic approach could charitably be described as enthusiastic but hopelessly naive. They were like that earnest student who studied twice as hard as everyone else and still managed to achieve perfectly mediocre results. Except the student in this case was an entire planetary civilization that somehow couldn't take a hint. The assessment protocols were standardized across all member species, refined through millennia of trial and error into a comprehensive evaluation that could reduce any civilization's potential to a neat set of numerical scores. Physical prowess, technological adaptability, tactical acumen, and psychological resilience. 4 categories that had successfully predicted the future performance of every species currently sitting on the Hegemony Council. Well, almost every species. There were a few notable exceptions, but those cases were classified at levels so high that even Zethkar's considerable security clearance only granted him access to heavily redacted reports that raised more questions than they answered. The prevailing theory was that some species were simply too alien for the standard protocols to evaluate properly, which was a polite way of saying the evaluation committee had given up trying to understand them and decided to let them into the club anyway. But humans? Humans were refreshingly straightforward. They fell neatly into every category the assessment was designed to measure, and their results were so consistently average that Zethkar had started using their scores as baseline references for other species. They were the galactic equivalent of a control group useful for comparison purposes, but not particularly noteworthy in their own right. His personal communicator chimed with the melodious tone that indicated an incoming priority message. The holographic display materialized above his wrist, showing the angular features of his assistant, Sub-Commander Vexilla, whose expression suggested she was about to deliver news that would make his day either significantly better or considerably worse. "Sir, the human delegation has arrived for today's assessment," she reported, her voice carrying that particular tone of professional neutrality that all good subordinates mastered when delivering potentially problematic information. Single candidate, as requested. Captain Raven Blackthorn, representing Earth's Colonial Defense Forces. Zethkar's mandibles clicked again, this time with genuine interest. A single candidate was unusual. Most species sent teams of specialists to tackle different aspects of the evaluation. Either the humans had finally developed some strategic thinking, or they had reached such depths of desperation that they were throwing random individuals at the problem in hopes that something would stick. Background? He inquired, already moving toward the assessment chamber's control center. The corridor leading there was lined with trophy cases containing artifacts from various species evaluations, weapons that had impressed the evaluators, technological innovations that had advanced galactic science, artistic expressions that had transcended cultural barriers. The human section was notably sparse, containing only a few items of historical interest and one particularly ugly sculpture that someone had donated out of what Zethkar suspected was pity. Former military engineer, decorated veteran of several colonial conflicts, advanced degrees in both applied physics and xenotechnology, Vexilla recited from her datapad. Age 34 standard years, no significant psychological flags, and she paused, which was never a good sign. She specifically requested the full evaluation suite. The full evaluation suite. Zethkar stopped walking. In his 3 decades of conducting assessments, fewer than 50 candidates had ever requested the full suite, and most of those had been either spectacular geniuses or spectacular idiots with more confidence than sense. The full suite wasn't just comprehensive, it was designed to be nearly impossible. A stress test that pushed candidates beyond their breaking points, to see what remained when everything else had been stripped away. Confidence or stupidity? He mused aloud. Unknown, sir. Her psychological profile suggests neither. She appears to be. Vexilla consulted her notes again, genuinely curious about the process itself. Curious. That was different. Most candidates approached the evaluation with either grim determination or barely contained terror. Curiosity was such an unusual response that Zethkar found himself genuinely intrigued for the first time in months. Perhaps this assessment wouldn't be a complete waste of time after all. The assessment chamber was a marvel of engineering and psychological manipulation, capable of generating virtually any environment or scenario the evaluator deemed appropriate. The walls, floor, and ceiling were composed of programmable matter that could reshape itself in response to neural commands, creating everything from simple combat arenas to complex multi-dimensional puzzles that challenged candidates' understanding of reality itself. At the center of the chamber stood Captain Raven Blackthorn, and Zethkar's first thought was that she looked exactly like what he had expected a human military engineer to look like: practical clothing, confident posture, and an expression that suggested she was already analyzing the chamber's capabilities while waiting for the assessment to begin. Her dark hair was pulled back in a functional style that wouldn't interfere with helmet systems, and her eyes held the particular gleam that engineers got when presented with interesting new problems to solve. She was, in other words, utterly unremarkable by galactic standards, which somehow made her presence more intriguing rather than less. Zethkar activated the chamber's communication system, his voice echoing from speakers positioned throughout the space. Captain Blackthorn, I am Commander Zethkar, your evaluator for today's assessment. Are you prepared to begin? The human looked up at the observation deck's windows, though she couldn't see through the one-way transparisteel. Her response came without hesitation. Ready when you are, Commander. Though I have to ask, is this where you usually start with the psychological intimidation, or do you save that for later in the process? Zethkar's mandibles clicked involuntarily. Humans weren't supposed to be that perceptive, or that direct. The assessment begins with basic physical conditioning. Please prepare yourself for combat simulation. The chamber floor began to shift and reconfigure, creating a standard martial arts arena with clearly defined boundaries and environmental hazards. It was a straightforward test designed to evaluate a candidate's basic combat reflexes, physical conditioning, and ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Most species either excelled through superior strength and speed, or compensated through superior tactics and strategy. Humans, in Zethkar's experience, usually tried to do both and succeeded at neither. Captain Blackthorne examined the arena with the methodical attention of someone conducting a technical inspection. She tested the floor's stability with her foot, gauged the lighting conditions, and appeared to be calculating angles and distances with the same precision another person might use to plan a construction project. "Interesting design," she commented, seemingly to herself. "The environmental hazards are positioned to force engagement rather than allowing defensive strategies. Very aggressive approach to evaluation." The first combat drone materialized at the arena's far end, a standard hegemony training unit, designed to provide appropriate challenge levels while maintaining safety protocols. It was roughly humanoid in shape, armed with non-lethal energy weapons, and programmed with combat algorithms derived from dozens of warrior species throughout the galaxy. "Begin when ready," Zethkar announced, settling back to observe what he expected to be a brief and predictable encounter. Captain Blackthorne didn't immediately move to engage the drone. Instead, she continued her apparent survey of the arena, walking slowly around its perimeter while the drone waited in combat-ready position. To most observers, it would have appeared that she was stalling for time or perhaps paralyzed by uncertainty. But something in her deliberate, measured pace suggested a different interpretation. She was gathering data. "You know," she said conversationally, still maintaining her inspection circuit, "most combat assessment protocols I'm familiar with emphasize speed and aggression. Get in fast, hit hard, overwhelm the opponent before they can mount an effective response. But this setup seems designed to reward patience and analysis over raw combat ability." The drone, programmed to engage when the candidate entered its threat radius, remained stationary as Blackthorne carefully avoided triggering its proximity sensors. She was maintaining perfect distance close enough to study its capabilities, far enough to avoid initiating combat until she was ready. "Are you planning to fight the drone, or bore it to death?" Zethkar inquired, though he found himself genuinely curious about her strategy. "Oh, I'm going to fight it," Blackthorne replied, finally completing her circuit and turning to face the drone directly. "I just wanted to understand what I was fighting first." She moved. What happened next wasn't what Zethkar had expected. Captain Blackthorne didn't charge the drone or attempt to match its superior speed and strength. Instead, she approached the engagement like an engineering problem that needed to be solved efficiently. She used the arena's environmental hazards not as obstacles to overcome, but as tools to manipulate the drone's positioning. She exploited its programming limitations, forcing it into predictable response patterns, and then capitalizing on the brief delays inherent in its decision-making algorithms. It wasn't elegant or impressive by traditional combat standards. It was systematic, methodical, and absolutely ruthless in its efficiency. The drone went down in less than 3 minutes, disabled rather than destroyed through what could only be described as death by 1,000 calculated cuts. Blackthorne had identified its primary power coupling, isolated its defensive systems, and then methodically stripped away its operational capabilities until it simply couldn't continue fighting. "Adequate," Zethkar said, though privately he was forced to admit it had been significantly better than adequate. "Prepare for escalation." 2 drones materialized this time, equipped with different weapon systems and programmed with more aggressive tactical algorithms. The arena's configuration shifted to provide less cover and more open space, reducing the opportunities for environmental manipulation. Captain Blackthorne examined the new setup with the same methodical attention she had shown before, though this time her analysis was quicker and more focused. "You're trying to force me into a direct engagement scenario," she observed. "Reduce the tactical options, increase the pressure, see how I perform under stress." "The evaluation adapts to each candidate's performance," Zethkar replied. "Are you ready to continue?" "Commander," Blackthorne said, turning once again toward the observation deck. "I have a question. Are you evaluating my ability to defeat your training systems, or my ability to solve the problems they represent?" It was an odd question, and Zethkar found himself considering it more seriously than he had intended. "Explain." "Well, defeating the drones is relatively straightforward. They're sophisticated, but they're still operating within defined parameters. Solving the problem they represent is more interesting. You're testing adaptability, tactical thinking, and performance under pressure. The drones are just the delivery mechanism. She was right, of course. The combat assessment wasn't really about combat, it was about how candidates approached complex, high-stress situations where the rules weren't entirely clear and the stakes were significant. Most species never grasped that distinction, focusing on the immediate tactical challenges rather than the underlying evaluation criteria. "Continue with the assessment, Captain," Zethkar said, but his tone had shifted slightly. This human was demonstrating a level of strategic understanding that exceeded his expectations. The second round lasted longer, but not because Captain Blackthorn was struggling. If anything, she seemed to be experimenting with different approaches, testing the drone's capabilities as much as demonstrating her own. She disabled the first drone using methods similar to her previous encounter, then engaged the second in what appeared to be a more traditional combat scenario, right up until she executed a maneuver that turned the drone's own weapons systems against it. "Clever," Zethkar admitted. "Are you ready for the next phase?" "Weapons evaluation?" Blackthorn asked, already moving toward the equipment materialization platform. "I have to say, I'm curious about your standard protocols. Most species probably approach this with their own familiar technology, right?" "Correct. Candidates typically demonstrate proficiency with their native weapon systems before adapting to hegemony standard equipment. The platform generated a selection of human weapons, projectile firearms, energy weapons, and various melee options that represented Earth's current military technology. Standard protocol called for candidates to demonstrate basic proficiency, then progress through increasingly sophisticated alien weapons until they reached their adaptation limit. Captain Blackthorn examined the human weapons with what appeared to be professional interest rather than familiarity. She selected a basic projectile rifle, checked its operation with practiced efficiency, and then set it aside without firing a single shot. "Adequate," she said, echoing Zethkar's earlier assessment. "But not particularly interesting from an engineering perspective. May I proceed directly to your standard equipment?" This was highly unusual. Most candidates spent considerable time demonstrating mastery of their native technology before reluctantly moving on to unfamiliar systems. The psychological comfort of familiar tools was considered an important factor in maintaining candidate confidence during the transition period. "You may," Zethkar replied, curious to see where this deviation would lead. The platform reconfigured, generating a selection of hegemony standard weapons that represented various technological approaches and operational philosophies. Plasma rifles from the Corvani, gravity manipulators from the Ethereals, molecular disruptors from species whose names were difficult to pronounce and whose methods were considered slightly disturbing by galactic standards. Captain Blackthorn approached the display like a child presented with an especially interesting collection of toys. She picked up the plasma rifle first, hefting it to test its weight and balance, then began systematically examining its construction and operation principles. "Fascinating design philosophy," she murmured, apparently talking to herself rather than providing commentary for Zethkar's benefit. "Brute force approach to energy projection, but the containment system is elegant, probably reliable under field conditions, though I bet it suffers from thermal management issues during sustained fire." She activated the weapon's diagnostic mode, something most candidates never discovered existed, and began cycling through its various operational parameters while studying the data displays. Within minutes, she had not only figured out how to operate the weapon effectively, but had begun identifying potential modifications to improve its performance. "Captain," Zethkar interrupted, "the evaluation requires demonstrated proficiency, not theoretical analysis." "Right. Sorry." Blackthorn activated the arena's target system and proceeded to demonstrate not just proficiency, but genuine expertise with the plasma rifle. Her accuracy was impressive, her tactical employment was sound, and her adaptation speed was remarkable. But what caught Zethkar's attention was her apparent dissatisfaction with the weapon's standard configuration. "May I make a small modification?" she asked, already beginning to disassemble the rifle's focusing array. That is not part of the standard protocol, Zethkar replied, though his curiosity was definitely piqued. I understand, but I think I can improve its thermal efficiency by about 15%, and I'd like to test the hypothesis. Weapon modification during evaluation was not just unusual, it was unprecedented. The weapons were sophisticated pieces of technology that had been refined through centuries of development. The idea that a candidate from a species not even admitted to the hegemony could identify improvement opportunities was either laughably arrogant or genuinely remarkable. Proceed, Zethkar said, deciding that unprecedented situations called for unprecedented responses. What followed was a display of technical expertise that forced Zethkar to reconsider his assumptions about human technological capabilities. Captain Blackthorn didn't just modify the plasma rifle, she optimized it, making subtle adjustments to its focusing algorithms and containment field geometry that improved both its efficiency and its effective range. More impressive still, she did it all using principles that Zethkar recognized as sound theoretical foundations, even though the specific applications were completely novel. The modified weapon performed exactly as she had predicted. 15% improvement in thermal efficiency, with corresponding gains in sustained fire capability and overall reliability. It was quite simply a better weapon than the original. Interesting, Zethkar said, which was possibly the greatest understatement of his career. Shall we continue? Captain Blackthorn worked her way through the remaining weapons with the same systematic approach, demonstrating not just rapid adaptation but genuine innovation with each system she encountered. The gravity manipulator's field generators were recalibrated for more precise control. The molecular disruptor's targeting system was enhanced for improved accuracy. By the time she finished, she had not only mastered the hegemony's standard weapons, but had improved every single one of them. Final phase, Zethkar announced, trying to maintain his professional composure despite the growing realization that this evaluation was unlike any he had previously conducted. Tactical Command Assessment. The arena transformed into a comprehensive battle management center, complete with holographic displays, communication systems, and real-time tactical analysis tools. The scenario was one of Zethkar's favorites, a complex multi-front engagement that required candidates to coordinate diverse forces while adapting to constantly changing battlefield conditions. Most candidates struggled with the scope and complexity of the scenario. The successful ones typically fell back on established tactical doctrine, applying proven strategies to novel situations with varying degrees of effectiveness. The exceptional candidates demonstrated the ability to innovate tactically while maintaining strategic coherence. Captain Blackthorn approached the command interface with the same methodical attention she had shown throughout the evaluation. She familiarized herself with the available tools, studied the initial tactical situation, and began issuing orders with calm, professional competence. For the first several minutes, her performance was entirely within expected parameters. She made sound tactical decisions, adapted reasonably well to changing conditions, and demonstrated the kind of steady competence that characterized effective military leadership. Zethkar found himself settling into routine observation mode, preparing to conclude the evaluation with the standard debrief and recommendation process. Then Captain Blackthorn did something that caught him completely off guard. She paused the simulation. "Commander," she said, turning toward the observation deck, "I have a request. This is an interesting scenario, but it's fundamentally reactive. I'm responding to predetermined challenges, using predefined resources according to established tactical principles. Would it be possible to run a more creative evaluation?" "Explain," Zethkar said, though he was already beginning to suspect that he knew where this was heading. "Well, the scenario assumes that I'm working within hegemony tactical doctrine, using hegemony resources to solve hegemony-defined problems. But humans don't think that way. We tend to approach problems from different angles, and we're not particularly respectful of established limitations. Could we try something less constrained?" Zethkar considered this request carefully. The standard tactical assessment was designed to evaluate candidates within the context of existing hegemony military structure. It assumed that successful species would integrate into established systems and operate according to proven methods. The idea of conducting an evaluation that deliberately encouraged deviation from established doctrine was not just unusual, it was potentially problematic. On the other hand, Captain Blackthorne had already exceeded his expectations in every other aspect of the evaluation. If she was requesting a more challenging assessment, perhaps it was worth exploring what that might reveal. "What do you propose?" he asked. "Let me design the scenario," Blackthorne replied. "Give me the same simulation tools, but let me create the tactical situation. Then you take command of the opposing forces, and we'll see what happens." This was not just unprecedented, it was a complete reversal of the evaluation process. Instead of the candidate demonstrating their ability to work within established parameters, she was proposing to create her own parameters and challenge the evaluator to adapt to them. It was either brilliant or completely insane, and Zethkar found himself genuinely uncertain which interpretation was more accurate. "Very well," he said finally. "Configure your scenario." Captain Blackthorne turned back to the command interface with obvious enthusiasm, her fingers dancing across the control surfaces with the fluid precision of someone who had found their natural environment. The holographic displays began to shift and reconfigure as she built her tactical scenario from the ground up, creating a situation that bore little resemblance to the standard hegemony evaluation templates. The scenario she constructed was deceptively simple in its initial presentation: two roughly equivalent forces facing each other across a standard battlefield environment. But as Zethkar began to examine the details, he realized that simplicity was illusory. The resource allocation was asymmetric in ways that didn't immediately make sense. The terrain features seemed random, until he noticed that they created subtle advantages and disadvantages that weren't apparent without careful analysis. The victory conditions were clear but could be achieved through multiple pathways that might not become obvious until the battle was well underway. "Interesting design," he admitted, taking control of the opposing forces. "Are you ready to begin?" "Commander," Captain Blackthorne said, and her tone had shifted to something that Zethkar couldn't quite identify. "I should mention that this scenario is based on a historical engagement. The Battle of Thermopylae. If you're familiar with human military history, the tactical situation has been updated for current technology, but the fundamental strategic principles remain the same." Zethkar was not familiar with human military history, but the name sounded ominous in ways he couldn't quite articulate. "Proceed." The battle began conventionally enough. Captain Blackthorne deployed her forces according to what appeared to be standard defensive doctrine, establishing strong positions and preparing to absorb the initial assault. Zethkar responded with proven tactical approaches, probing for weaknesses while building toward a concentrated assault that should overwhelm her defensive positions through superior numbers and firepower. Except her defensive positions weren't what they appeared to be. What Zethkar had interpreted as standard defensive deployment turned out to be an elaborate trap, designed to channel his forces into predetermined killing zones, where her inferior numbers could be concentrated against isolated portions of his superior force. The terrain features that had seemed random were actually carefully planned obstacles that limited his tactical flexibility while maximizing her defensive advantages. It was, quite simply, brilliant tactical design. But more than that, it was tactical design that operated according to principles that Zethkar didn't immediately recognize. She wasn't just applying human tactical doctrine to a novel situation, she was using approaches that seemed to violate established military theory while somehow achieving superior results. The first phase of the engagement went badly for his forces. The second phase went worse. By the third phase, Zethkar found himself in the unfamiliar position of being comprehensively outmaneuvered by a candidate species that wasn't even supposed to be capable of advanced tactical thinking. "Captain," he said, pausing the simulation, "what tactical school is this based on?" "Human tactical school," Blackthorne replied with what sounded suspiciously like amusement. "We have this annoying habit of refusing to lose gracefully. When we can't win through superior strength or superior technology, we get creative." Sometimes we get very creative. She resumed the simulation before Zethkar could respond, and the next phase of the engagement demonstrated just how creative human tactical thinking could become. She began employing strategies that weren't just unconventional, they were actively contrary to established military doctrine. Instead of consolidating her advantages, she dispersed her forces in ways that should have made them vulnerable to piecemeal destruction. Instead of maintaining defensive positions, she began launching limited attacks that seemed designed more to confuse than to achieve territorial gains. It took Zethkar several critical minutes to realize that her apparently chaotic tactics were actually sophisticated psychological warfare designed to undermine his decision-making process by creating uncertainty about her actual objectives and capabilities. She wasn't just fighting a tactical battle, she was fighting a strategic campaign aimed at his confidence and analytical abilities. And it was working. By the time he recognized what was happening, she had maneuvered him into a position where every decision he could make would result in unacceptable losses. His superior forces were scattered across the battlefield, unable to coordinate effectively, while her inferior forces had somehow achieved local superiority at every critical point of engagement. The simulation ended with his complete tactical defeat, achieved through methods that shouldn't have worked against a competent opponent using proven strategies and superior resources. "That's all you got?" Captain Blackthorne asked, and there was definitely amusement in her voice now. Zethkar stared at the holographic displays showing the final battle positions, trying to process what had just happened. In 30 years of conducting evaluations, he had never been tactically defeated by a candidate. He had never even been seriously challenged by a candidate. The evaluation process was specifically designed to prevent such reversals, using scenarios and parameters that ensured the evaluator maintained control of the assessment at all times. Captain Blackthorne had not just defeated him tactically. She had done it using approaches that violated fundamental assumptions about how tactical engagements were supposed to work. She had treated the evaluation as a learning experience, using each phase to gather information about his decision-making patterns and tactical preferences, then exploited that information to create scenarios where his advantages became liabilities. She had, in essence, evaluated him while he was attempting to evaluate her. "Captain," he said finally, "what was the historical outcome of the original Battle of Thermopylae?" "The defenders lost," she replied cheerfully. "They were completely outnumbered and outgunned, and they knew they were going to lose from the beginning. But they held the position long enough to achieve their strategic objectives, and their sacrifice became the foundation for ultimate victory." "But you won this engagement." "Well, yes, because I had the advantage of superior technology and tactical flexibility. The Spartans at Thermopylae were limited to Bronze Age weapons and classical tactical doctrine. I had access to your simulation systems and 3 centuries of human military innovation. It would have been embarrassing if I hadn't been able to improve on their performance." Zethkar's mandibles clicked involuntarily. She had not only defeated him tactically, she had done it using a battle plan that was explicitly based on a historical defeat, improved through technological and tactical advantages that she had gained by studying his evaluation methods. "Commander," Captain Blackthorne continued, "I have another request. Could we reverse roles for the final assessment? I'd like to evaluate your performance using human tactical doctrine." This was so far beyond standard protocol that Zethkar wasn't even sure how to classify it. Candidates didn't evaluate their evaluators. The entire concept was contrary to the fundamental structure of the assessment process. It was presumptuous, inappropriate, and completely outside the bounds of acceptable behavior. It was also the most interesting proposal he had received in 3 decades of conducting evaluations. "Explain your assessment criteria," he said. Captain Blackthorne's smile was distinctly predatory. "Human military doctrine emphasizes adaptability over superiority, innovation over established method, and strategic thinking over tactical execution. We excel in situations where the rules are unclear, the resources are limited, and the objectives require creative interpretation." She began configuring a new scenario, and Zethkar watched with growing apprehension as she constructed a tactical situation that bore no resemblance to any standard military engagement he had ever encountered. The resource allocation was bizarre, the terrain was actively hostile to both sides, and the victory conditions seemed to change dynamically based on the actions of both commanders. This scenario is based on asymmetric warfare principles, she explained as she worked. Both sides have significant disadvantages, neither side has clear tactical superiority, and success requires the ability to identify and exploit opportunities that aren't immediately apparent. It's designed to reward creative thinking over established doctrine. The scenario she had created was nightmarish from a conventional tactical perspective. Both forces were operating under severe resource constraints, in an environment that was actively dangerous to military operations, with objectives that seemed to contradict basic strategic logic. It was the kind of situation that military academies throughout the galaxy used as examples of engagements to be avoided at all costs. "Begin when ready," Captain Blackthorne said, settling into the evaluator's position with obvious satisfaction. Zethkar approached the tactical interface with considerably less enthusiasm than he had shown at the beginning of the evaluation. The scenario violated so many principles of sound military planning that he wasn't even sure where to begin. His forces were scattered, under-equipped, and operating in an environment that seemed designed to maximize confusion and minimize effectiveness. He began with standard consolidation protocols, attempting to organize his scattered resources into coherent tactical units that could operate according to established doctrine. The results were immediately disastrous. The terrain actively interfered with communication and coordination. The resource constraints made standard logistical support impossible, and the environmental hazards eliminated several units before he could even establish proper command structure. "Interesting approach," Captain Blackthorne commented, her tone clinically analytical. "You're attempting to impose order on a chaotic situation using established organizational methods. That's exactly what I expected, and exactly why it won't work in this scenario." "What would work?" Zethkar asked, pausing the simulation to reassess his tactical options. "Innovation," she replied. "Stop trying to fight the scenario and start working with it. The chaos isn't a bug, it's a feature. The resource constraints aren't obstacles, they're opportunities. The environmental hazards aren't problems, they're tools." This was tactical thinking that ran contrary to everything Zethkar had learned in his military training. Chaos was something to be controlled, resources were to be maximized, hazards were to be avoided. The idea that these factors could be leveraged as advantages, rather than overcome as obstacles, was so foreign to his thinking that he struggled even to conceptualize how such an approach might work. "Demonstrate," he said finally. Captain Blackthorne took control of his forces and immediately began implementing strategies that made no sense according to conventional tactical analysis. She dispersed his units even further, abandoning any attempt to maintain centralized command. She deliberately moved forces into the most dangerous areas of the battlefield, using environmental hazards as cover rather than avoiding them. She began using the resource constraints as tactical advantages, forcing his opposition to overextend themselves while maintaining flexibility with minimal logistics requirements. It was anarchic, unpredictable, and absolutely effective. Within minutes, she had transformed his scattered, under-equipped forces into a coherent tactical threat that operated according to principles he didn't recognize but couldn't argue with. Her units moved independently but cooperatively, adapted to changing conditions without requiring centralized coordination, and achieved tactical objectives through methods that violated every rule of military engagement he had ever learned. "This is how humans fight," she explained as her unconventional tactics systematically dismantled the opposing forces. "We don't try to impose order on chaos, we embrace the chaos and use it against opponents who insist on fighting according to predictable methods. We don't overcome disadvantages, we turn disadvantages into advantages by approaching them from angles that nobody expects." "But this violates fundamental tactical principles," Zethkar protested, even as he watched her achieve tactical victory through methods that shouldn't have worked. "Human tactical principles," Captain Blackthorne replied, are based on the assumption that most engagements can't be won through conventional methods. We've spent our entire military history fighting opponents who were stronger, better equipped, and more numerous than we were. We got very good at finding ways to win anyway. The simulation ended with complete victory for the forces under her command, achieved through tactical methods that Zethkar couldn't have conceived of and wouldn't have believed could work if he hadn't observed them directly. She had not only reversed the evaluation process, she had used it to demonstrate capabilities that exceeded anything in his experience with candidate species. Assessment complete, Captain Blackthorne announced, turning toward the observation deck with obvious satisfaction. Commander, you show reasonable tactical competence within established parameters, but limited adaptability when faced with unconventional challenges. You rely too heavily on proven methods and struggle when required to innovate under pressure. Overall evaluation, adequate for routine operations, but unsuitable for complex strategic planning or unconventional warfare. Zethkar's mandibles clicked reflexively. In the space of a single evaluation session, he had been systematically outperformed, outmaneuvered, and ultimately evaluated by the candidate he was supposed to be assessing. It was humiliating, educational, and utterly unprecedented. It was also, he was forced to admit, probably accurate. Captain, he said finally, what was the purpose of this demonstration? Evaluation, she replied with a slight smile. You've been assessing species for membership in the hegemony for 3 decades. I wanted to understand what that assessment process revealed about the hegemony itself. And your conclusions? The hegemony is an organization that values competence, order, and predictability. Your evaluation methods are designed to identify species that can operate effectively within established systems and follow proven procedures. That's an excellent approach for maintaining institutional stability and ensuring reliable performance from member species. She paused, and her expression became more serious. But it's also an approach that systematically excludes species that might contribute something genuinely new. You're not evaluating potential, you're evaluating compatibility, and there's a significant difference between those two things. Zethkar considered this observation carefully. The evaluation protocols had been refined over millennia to identify species that could integrate successfully into hegemony civilization. They prioritized characteristics that predicted successful membership competence within established parameters, respect for institutional authority, willingness to operate according to proven methods. They were specifically designed to exclude species that might be disruptive to galactic stability. And humans, he said slowly, are potentially disruptive. Commander, Captain Blackthorne replied, humans are definitely disruptive. We question established methods, we innovate under pressure, and we have this annoying habit of finding new ways to solve old problems. We're not particularly good at following rules we don't understand, and we're terrible at accepting limitations we think are arbitrary. She gestured toward the assessment chamber's sophisticated systems. Your evaluation process is designed to exclude species like us. The question is whether that's because we're genuinely unsuitable for hegemony membership, or because the hegemony is genuinely unsuitable for species like us. The implications of this statement hung in the air between them, like an unexploded ordnance. Zethkar had spent his entire career assuming that species which failed the evaluation were simply not ready for galactic civilization. The possibility that the evaluation itself might be the limiting factor was not something he had seriously considered. Captain, he said carefully, are you suggesting that the assessment process is flawed? I'm suggesting that the assessment process is working exactly as designed, she replied. It identifies species that will integrate smoothly into existing hegemony structures and excludes species that might challenge those structures. That's not a flaw, that's a feature, but it does raise interesting questions about what the hegemony might be missing. Zethkar's communicator chimed with an incoming priority message. Sub-Commander Vexilla's image appeared, her expression conveying urgent concern. Sir, we have a situation. Long-range sensors are detecting multiple human vessels approaching the station. Fleet strength, military configuration, and then not responding to standard communication protocols. Captain Blackthorn's smile became distinctly predatory. "Ah," she said, "right on schedule." "Schedule?" Zethkar's mandibles clicked with sudden apprehension. "Commander, I should probably mention that I wasn't sent here to request hegemony membership," Captain Blackthorn said, her tone shifting to something that was almost apologetic. "I was sent here to evaluate the hegemony for potential human expansion opportunities." The bottom dropped out of Zethkar's understanding of the situation. "Expansion opportunities? Well, you see, we've been watching galactic civilization for quite some time now. Learning about your technologies, your political structures, your military capabilities, and we've reached some interesting conclusions about humanity's place in the galaxy." She gestured toward the observation deck's windows, where the first human vessels were becoming visible as bright points of light against the stellar background. "We've decided that we don't particularly want to join the hegemony. We're more interested in establishing our own interstellar civilization, based on human principles and human methods." "But the assessment was reconnaissance," Captain Blackthorn finished. "Fix. I needed to understand your capabilities, your decision-making processes, and your institutional limitations. The best way to do that was to let you evaluate me, while I evaluated you." More human vessels were appearing, their configurations clearly indicating military purpose. Zethkar's tactical training automatically began analyzing their deployment patterns, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The humans weren't approaching Station Nexus 7 like supplicants seeking membership, they were approaching like conquerors conducting reconnaissance in force. "This is an act of war," he said. "No," Captain Blackthorn replied calmly. "This is an act of diplomacy. We're here to establish relations with the hegemony on equal terms. The fleet is just there to ensure that those relations remain appropriately respectful. The hegemony doesn't negotiate with non-member species. The hegemony is about to learn some new diplomatic protocols," she said with obvious satisfaction. "You see, Commander, your evaluation process taught me something very important about galactic civilization. You're also focused on maintaining order and following established procedures that you've forgotten how to adapt to genuinely new situations." She activated the chamber's communication system, broadcasting on frequencies that would reach both the approaching human fleet and Station Nexus 7's command center. "This is Captain Raven Blackthorn of the Terran Colonial Defense Forces, speaking for humanity. We come in peace, but we come as equals. The hegemony has 30 standard hours to establish formal diplomatic relations with Earth, or we will consider this sector to be available for human colonization." "You can't simply claim galactic territory," Zethkar protested. "Watch us," Captain Blackthorn replied. "Commander, your species has had 3,000 years to develop effective methods for dealing with established civilizations that operate according to predictable rules. But you've never had to deal with a species that refuses to follow those rules." The human fleet had completed its deployment, and Zethkar's tactical analysis confirmed his worst fears. Their positioning was perfect for either defensive operations or offensive expansion, depending on the hegemony's response. More troubling still, their technology appeared to be significantly more advanced than the databases had indicated, incorporating innovations that shouldn't have been possible with Earth's supposed technological base. "How long have you been planning this?" he asked. "About 200 years, Captain Blackthorn replied cheerfully. "We've been using your rejection of our membership applications as opportunities to study hegemony civilization from the inside. Every delegation you've evaluated has gathered intelligence about your capabilities, your decision-making processes, and your institutional weaknesses. You've been conducting espionage operations. We've been conducting anthropological research," she corrected. "There's a difference, though I admit the practical results are somewhat similar. The point is, we know how the hegemony thinks, how it operates, and how it responds to various types of challenges." She gestured toward the tactical displays that still showed the results of their reversed evaluation. "Your civilization is extremely competent at managing known challenges using proven methods. but you're institutionally incapable of adapting to genuinely novel situations. That's, simultaneously, your greatest strength and your most critical vulnerability. And humanity intends to exploit that vulnerability? Humanity intends to coexist with galactic civilization on mutually beneficial terms, Captain Blackthorne said. But we're not going to do it by subordinating ourselves to institutions that view us as primitives to be evaluated rather than equals to be respected. Zethkar's communicator chimed again, this time with a message from the station commander requesting his immediate presence in the main briefing chamber. The human fleet's arrival had obviously triggered emergency protocols throughout the hegemony command structure. I have to report this situation, he said. Of course you do. And when you make that report, I want you to include my evaluation of hegemony tactical capabilities. Captain Blackthorne handed him a data storage device. You'll find it quite comprehensive. Zethkar accepted the device with considerable reluctance. What does it conclude? That the hegemony's military forces are extremely competent at fighting conventional wars against conventional opponents using conventional methods, she replied. Unfortunately for the hegemony, humans don't fight conventional wars. Captain, what do you want? Recognition as an independent interstellar civilization with equal status to the hegemony. Formal diplomatic relations. Trade agreements that benefit both sides. And most importantly, an end to the assumption that every species in the galaxy needs to conform to hegemony standards in order to be considered civilized. She moved toward the chamber's exit, pausing at the threshold to look back at him. Commander, you asked me earlier what the purpose of this demonstration was. The real purpose was to show you that your evaluation process doesn't just assess candidates, it reveals the limitations of the evaluators. And what limitations did you identify? The hegemony has become so focused on maintaining stability that it's lost the ability to recognize genuine innovation. You've created a civilization that's very good at perpetuating itself, but very poor at evolving. That's not a sustainable long-term strategy in a universe that's constantly changing. Captain Blackthorne departed, leaving Zethkar alone in the assessment chamber, with the tactical displays still showing the results of his comprehensive defeat and the data storage device containing her evaluation of hegemony capabilities. Outside the chamber's windows, the human fleet maintained its position with the patient confidence of a force that knew it held all the tactical advantages. For 30 years, Zethkar had conducted evaluations that determined whether species were ready to join galactic civilization. Today, he had been evaluated by a species that had decided galactic civilization needed to change instead. The irony was not lost on him that the humans had used his own assessment methods to demonstrate the inadequacy of those methods. They had turned the evaluation process against itself, revealing its inherent biases and institutional limitations through the simple expedient of refusing to accept its assumptions. As he prepared to report the situation to his superiors, Zethkar found himself considering Captain Blackthorne's final observation. The hegemony had indeed become very good at perpetuating itself, but perhaps at the cost of its ability to adapt to genuinely new challenges. The evaluation process that had served galactic civilization for millennia might have become a constraint rather than a tool, excluding not just unsuitable species, but potentially valuable ones. The humans had not just failed the assessment they had made, the assessment itself irrelevant by demonstrating capabilities that exceeded its ability to measure. They had approached the evaluation as a learning opportunity rather than a test to be passed, gathering information while providing demonstrations of tactical and technological innovation that challenged fundamental assumptions about their capabilities. More troubling still, they had done it all with the casual competence of a species that had been planning this outcome for centuries. The evaluation process that was supposed to protect galactic civilization from disruptive influences had instead provided those influences with detailed intelligence about the civilization they intended to disrupt. His communicator chimed again, this time with an urgent message from the Hegemony Council itself. The human fleet's arrival had triggered emergency protocols at the highest levels of galactic government, and Zethkar's evaluation report was being requested by individuals whose authority spanned star systems. As he reviewed the data Captain Blackthorne had provided, Zethkar realized that her evaluation of hegemony capabilities was more comprehensive and more accurate than most of the reports generated by the hegemony's own intelligence services. She had identified tactical weaknesses, institutional limitations, and strategic vulnerabilities that had been invisible to internal analysis precisely because they were so fundamental to hegemony thinking that no one had thought to question them. The humans had not just demonstrated their own capabilities, they had demonstrated the hegemony's incapabilities with the methodical precision of a species that had been studying the problem for generations. In his report to the Council, Zethkar found himself in the unprecedented position of recommending that a species be granted full diplomatic recognition without having passed the standard evaluation protocols. Not because they had demonstrated compatibility with hegemony civilization, but because they had demonstrated the ability to operate independently of it while possessing capabilities that made opposition inadvisable. The humans had, in essence, evaluated themselves into a position where traditional evaluation criteria were irrelevant. They had approached the assessment not as supplicants seeking admission, but as equals conducting due diligence before establishing formal relations. 3 days later, the Hegemony Council voted to establish formal diplomatic relations with the Terran Colonial Defense Forces, making humanity the first species in galactic history to achieve equal status without passing the standard evaluation protocols. The decision was described in official communications as recognition of unique circumstances, requiring innovative diplomatic approaches. Captain Blackthorne's response to the announcement was typically direct. "About time. We've been ready to talk whenever you were ready to listen." 6 months after the evaluation, Zethkar received a personal message from Captain Blackthorne, informing him that human tactical innovations had been incorporated into the training protocols of 17 different hegemony military academies, and that her modifications to standard weapon systems had been adopted as official improvements by the hegemony defense forces. Apparently, her message concluded, "We weren't as unsuitable for galactic civilization as your evaluation process suggested. We were just unsuitable for subordinate status within existing galactic institutions. There's a difference, though I understand why your evaluation methods had trouble identifying it." The postscript was even more unsettling. "Oh, and Commander, you might want to reconsider your evaluation protocols. The next species that approaches the hegemony for assessment might be even less interested in following your rules than we were. The galaxy is a big place, and humans aren't the only ones who think differently." Zethkar kept that message in his personal files as a reminder that evaluation was a two-way process, and that sometimes the most important discoveries came from candidates who refused to accept the limitations of the assessment itself. The Combat Assessment Center continued to operate according to established protocols, but with new provisions for candidates who demonstrated capabilities that exceeded standard evaluation parameters. After all, as Captain Blackthorne had so effectively demonstrated, the purpose of evaluation was supposed to be understanding potential, not enforcing conformity. And in a universe full of species with their own unique approaches to existence, perhaps the greatest limitation was assuming that there was only one correct way to be civilized. The humans had not just passed an evaluation that was designed to exclude them, they had transformed the evaluation itself into something that could recognize genuinely innovative potential, rather than simply measuring compatibility with existing limitations. It was, Zethkar had to admit, exactly the kind of approach he should have expected from a species that specialized in turning disadvantages into advantages through sheer tactical creativity. The galaxy, it seemed, was about to become a much more interesting place.